Good morning, Alex and friends. I'm Grace. Today is Tuesday, December 2nd, 2025, and you're listening to Alex's News. The high in Riverside on December 2nd, 2025 is 68.5 degrees, and the low will be 45.3, so grab a light jacket for the evening chill. Coming up, we'll break down the key developments to watch as a U.S. envoy sits down with Putin while Zelenskyy continues his European tour, and examine why anti-abortion advocates are challenging a donor record subpoena before the Supreme Court. Plus, other stories on global tensions, domestic policy battles, and more. All this and more coming up on Alex's News. Stay tuned. Good morning. A high-stakes push to end the Russia-Ukraine war is unfolding right now. Reporter Ethan Morris is with us. Ethan, set the scene for us.
Grace, the big development today is in Moscow, where U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff met directly with Vladimir Putin at the Kremlin. According to the Washington Post and CBS News, Jared Kushner joined Witkoff, and the only other person on the U.S. side was an interpreter. The talks center on a revised peace framework the Trump administration has been reshaping with Ukrainian input over the past week.
Why is this meeting so unusual?
It's unusual because Witkoff isn't a traditional diplomat. He's a real estate developer and longtime friend of President Trump. The White House defends his role as standard back-channel diplomacy, but the Washington Post reports critics are uneasy, citing his lack of Senate confirmation and questions about past Russian ties. Still, the administration argues an unconventional messenger might get traction with Moscow.
What exactly is on the table today?
The plan started as a 28-point draft that leaked late last month, and according to Time and the Washington Post, drew fire for leaning toward Russia on territory and sanctions. After pushback, U.S. and Ukrainian teams met in Geneva 9 days ago, then in Florida 2 days ago, trimming it to roughly 20 points. NBC Chicago, citing the Associated Press, reported Ukrainian officials called the latest version more palatable, though major issues remain.
Which issues are the hardest to resolve?
Territory is the big one. What happens to Crimea and parts of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson? The original draft floated, recognizing some areas as de facto Russian and freezing lines elsewhere, which Kyiv found unacceptable. There's also Ukraine's future army size, NATO aspirations, and whether sanctions are lifted, as the Washington Post notes.
What's Russia signaling about its red lines?
Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov called the U.S. paper a, quote, very good basis for negotiations, end quote, in late November, according to The Guardian. But he also said Russia will keep pursuing its military objectives if it doesn't get what it wants on territory and security. The Moscow Times adds the Kremlin wants to avoid what it calls megaphone diplomacy while the talks are live.
Any details on how long today's session ran?
Peskov said it would last as long as needed and would take place in the second half of the day Moscow time. CBS News reported the Kremlin planned to release an opening clip but keep the substance quiet. As of this evening Moscow time, there's no public readout of concessions either side made.
How involved is President Trump himself?
Very involved behind the scenes. PBS notes he's frustrated after months of stalled talks and has endorsed Witkoff's direct channel while reserving sensitive calls for himself. The White House press secretary Caroline Leavitt said there were, quote, very good talks, end quote, in Florida, according to Time, and the tone remains optimistic.
Speaking of Florida, what happened there 2 days ago?
That's where Secretary of State Marco Rubio hosted Ukraine's national security chief, Rustem Umerov, in Hallandale Beach. KSAT, via the AP, reports Rubio called the discussions productive but said more work is needed. It was the second major round after Geneva on November 23rd, which was 9 days ago.
Did those rounds actually change the plan?
Ukrainian officials say yes, at least in structure and tone. U.S. News and World Report, citing the AP, says the text was reduced from 28 to about 20 points and made significantly better for Ukraine. Zelenskyy himself said the document looked better, but, quote, the territorial issue is the most difficult, end quote, as The Guardian and the Kyiv Independent reported.
What about the more controversial ideas in the original draft?
The leak suggested caps on Ukraine's army at around 600,000 troops, a ban on NATO membership, and an end to Western military aid after a deal. Time and The Washington Post also described provisions to lift sanctions and use about $100 billion in frozen Russian assets for Ukraine's reconstruction. We don't have a point-by-point on what survived, but Kyiv pushed back hardest on territory and NATO.
While those talks happened, where is Zelenskyy today?
He's in Ireland today, his first official trip there after a stop in Paris yesterday. NBC Chicago, via the AP, says he met Irish leaders, addressed lawmakers, and opened a bilateral economic forum trying to keep Europe fully engaged in peace talks. He traveled with First Lady Olena Zelenskyi to emphasize the civilian costs and the need for long-term support.
What did he do in Paris yesterday?
He met President Emmanuel Macron and toured a defense plant near Paris. According to KSAT via the AP, he held a call that included Witkoff, Macron, several European leaders, EU officials, and NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. Macron called the coming U.S.-Western talks crucial, signaling France wants a hand on the wheel, not just a seat in the back.
Is Zelenskyy worried about being sidelined?
He is, and he's pushing back. The Kyiv Independent reports he warned allies about Russian disinformation aimed at easing sanctions and blocking EU aid, promising to share intelligence on Moscow's intentions. He also reiterated Kyiv's red lines: no forced concessions on territory or its western path.
How are European leaders reacting?
Cautiously but firmly. The Guardian has quoted EU foreign policy chief Kaja Kallas and leaders like Germany's Friedrich Merz as rejecting a dictated peace and warning against rewarding aggression. They're also grappling with money. AP's reporting notes concerns about funding gaps after 2025 and how to structure security guarantees that deter future Russian attacks.
What about the battlefield? What's the latest there?
Russia claimed yesterday it captured Pokrovsk, a logistics hub in Donetsk, and Putin was briefed by his top commanders, according to the Moscow Times and CBS News. Ukraine flatly denies it, saying fighting continues and that they repelled dozens of assaults, the Kyiv Independent reports. The Institute for the Study of War assessed that Russian forces have a presence inside the city, but haven't fully seized it.
Does that claim affect the negotiations?
It may be an attempt at leverage. Analysts told outlets like PBS that Moscow often uses battlefield narratives to shape perceptions at the table, what some call cognitive warfare. But if ISW is right and Ukrainian positions hold in the north with drone support, that undercuts a full victory claim.
Is Russia showing any flexibility at all?
Not publicly. Peskov's comments suggest openness to talk structure, but not on core aims, especially territory. The Guardian and Time both note the Kremlin still speaks in terms of its special operation mission, which has always required formal recognition of its annexations.
And Ukraine's biggest concerns?
Security guarantees that actually deter Russia, the future size and strength of its armed forces, and ensuring the West doesn't walk away after a deal. The Washington Post reports Kyiv is also wary of sanctions relief that would give Moscow resources to rearm. Above all, Zelenskyy keeps stressing that sovereignty and territorial integrity aren't negotiable.
How does the frozen assets piece fit in?
The earlier draft floated using about $100 billion from frozen Russian state assets for Ukraine's reconstruction, with European holdings transferred to the U.S. to manage. Time reported that drew legal and political questions in Europe, where many of those assets sit. It's unclear if that mechanism survives in the trimmed plan, or if it shifts to windfall taxes on interest.
Are there signs of a breakthrough tonight?
Not yet. The Kremlin appears to be limiting disclosures, and AP outlets say there's no agreed readout from the U.S. either. Diplomats speaking to U.S. News and World Report via AP still predict a long road to peace, even if today's tone was constructive.
So why is the White House optimistic?
Partly because the Florida session produced what Leavitt called, quote, very good talks, end quote, and because the revised paper is no longer a non-starter for Kyiv. There's also confidence from recent U.S. mediation in the Gaza ceasefire, which the administration sees as a template for shuttle diplomacy. But as PBS points out, Russia's maximalist terms make this much harder than a ceasefire.
How are the Ukrainians holding up politically?
It's a tough period. The Guardian and the Kyiv Independent reported funding strains and a top aide's resignation tied to a corruption probe 2 days ago, all while trying to keep allies unified. That's part of why Zelenskyy is on the road. He needs Europe visibly and materially in the room.
Is Europe actually in the room this time?
More than before. Yesterday's call with Macron, several European leaders, the EU and NATO's Mark Rutte, suggests a deliberate effort to knit the US track with a European one. The optics matter too. Being seen as co-architects of peace helps counter any impression of a US-Russia carve-up.
What are skeptics watching for in the next 48 hours?
Whether Moscow publicly embraces, shelves, or tries to reframe the US paper, and whether Kyiv confirms any movement on the hardest points. The Moscow Times warned the Kremlin could muddy the waters if it says no without saying no. Also watch if the EU steps up with a synchronized security package to buttress Ukraine's position.
Any risk the talks backfire?
There's always risk. If Russia senses urgency, it may double down on demands, and if allies think Washington is moving too fast, it could splinter support. That's why, according to The Guardian, European leaders keep invoking a single phrase, durable peace, meaning a deal that actually sticks.
What does a realistic next step look like?
A structured pause for technical teams to redraft language on territory, forces, and sanction sequencing, followed by leader-level calls. If that happens quickly, say, within days, it would signal both sides see value in the framework. If it drags, expect more battlefield maneuvering and political messaging.
Final thought, Ethan. What should viewers remember as this evolves?
2 tracks are running at once: Witkoff's quiet diplomacy with Moscow and Zelenskyy's very public push in Europe to lock in support. According to CBS News and PBS, neither can succeed without the other, because any deal needs both Russian buy-in and Western guarantees. And, as of tonight, we have motion, but not yet a breakthrough.
All right, we'll keep watching. Ethan Morris, thank you. We're following a major First Amendment showdown at the Supreme Court today. Chloe, walk us through what's at stake.
The justices heard arguments this morning in First Choice Women's Resource Centers versus Platkin, a case out of New Jersey testing when federal courts can step in to block state subpoenas on free speech grounds. First Choice is a faith-based crisis pregnancy center that says a 2023 subpoena from Attorney General Matthew Platkin chills its speech and threatens its donors' privacy. According to NPR's coverage of the AP reporting today, the state is investigating whether the group misled clients and donors about what it does. The center says the probe is baseless and retaliatory, while the state says it's a routine consumer fraud inquiry.
What triggered the investigation in the first place?
Platkin's office flagged the group's online materials for potentially deceptive messaging under New Jersey's Consumer Fraud Act. ABC News, citing the Associated Press, reports investigators pointed to pages labeled Abortion Information Consultation and Post-Abortion Support, while disclosures that the center doesn't provide or refer for abortions appeared only at the bottom. The state also scrutinized promotions of so-called abortion pill reversal, which medical groups have criticized as unproven, and it compared donor-directed messaging to what prospective clients saw. SCOTUS blog's case preview notes the state framed it as ensuring claims are accurate and services clearly described.
And what exactly did the subpoena demand?
It sought a broad set of records, including identities of donors, especially from 2 fundraising websites, as well as advertising materials, claims substantiation, and personnel details. First Choice argues the donor demand is the most dangerous because it could expose supporters to harassment or reprisals. The Washington Post has made similar points in coverage of donor disclosure fights more broadly, and this case echoes those concerns. As NPR relayed, the center says the disclosure would chill associational rights at the heart of the First Amendment.
The group says there weren't even complaints. Is that right?
That's their position. Executive Director Amy Huber has said the probe is, quote, unfounded, unspecific, end quote, and targets their religious speech and pro-life views, according to ABC News, right up of the AP report. The state hasn't highlighted individual consumer complaints in its filings, but says it doesn't need a stack of them to look into potentially deceptive practices. In 2022 and 2023, the AG issued consumer alerts warning about crisis pregnancy centers, history of misinformation, which the Public's radio noted as part of the broader context.
So how did this end up before the Supreme Court?
First Choice went to federal district court to quash the subpoena, arguing it violates speech and association rights, but the judge said the case wasn't ripe because the subpoena is non-self-executing. In other words, no court has ordered compliance yet, and the state would have to go to court to enforce it. The Third Circuit affirmed, saying federal courts shouldn't jump in this early. Those rulings set up today's argument on whether a claimed chilling effect allows pre-enforcement review.
What's the central legal question the justices are wrestling with?
It's a jurisdictional fight about ripeness and the First Amendment. Can a federal court hear a challenge to a state investigatory subpoena based on an objective chilling effect? Or must the target refuse to comply and risk contempt in state court first? SCOTUS blog frames it as a test of how concrete the harm needs to be before federal judges can act. The court's past cases sometimes make room for early intervention when speech and association are chilled, but it's not automatic.
Which precedents are looming large here?
Two big ones came up in briefs and were expected to feature today. NAACP versus Alabama from 1958 protected associational privacy when disclosure would expose supporters to hostility and deter membership. And in 2021, in Americans for Prosperity Foundation versus Bonta, the court struck down California's blanket donor disclosure rule for charities as not narrowly tailored, even absent a showing that disclosure was effective against fraud. According to Oyez and Cornell Law's summaries, both cases underscore the court's sensitivity to compelled disclosure in the advocacy context.
How is New Jersey defending its approach?
The state says the subpoena is just a request unless and until a judge orders compliance, so there's no present injury. It argues compliance is entirely voluntary right now and warns that letting targets sue immediately would, as NPR reported from state filings, flood federal courts with pre-enforcement challenges to routine investigations. New Jersey also emphasizes its consumer protection interest, pointing to its alerts on crisis pregnancy centers and the need to verify medical and service claims. Its brief, highlighted by ABC News, frames First Choice's stance as asking for special treatment unavailable to other entities under investigation.
And what's First Choice's broader argument?
They say compelled disclosure of donors and sweeping document demands deter speech and association today, not just later, which makes waiting for enforcement untenable. ADF's Aaron Hawley told the court the issue is, quote, broad and non-ideological, end quote, because it affects groups with unpopular views across the spectrum. Notably, the ACLU filed a brief siding with First Choice on the First Amendment question, which the Public's radio flagged as a cross-ideological alignment. The center also challenges the state's focus on abortion pill reversal as singling out pro-life perspective rather than neutrally policing claims.
What did today's timeline look like for the hearing?
Arguments were this morning, December 2, 2025, and as usual, the court posted same-day audio and, later, the transcript on supremecourt.gov under oral arguments. Questions likely probed the two prongs of the ripeness doctrine, whether the issues are fit for decision now, and what hardship delay imposes. Given the topic, justices were expected to test whether First Choice's fears about donor harassment are speculative or backed by evidence, as SCOTUS blog previewed. Opinions won't come immediately. Decisions typically arrive months later, often by late spring or early summer.
How does this fit into the post-Dobbs landscape?
It's a direct outgrowth of the policy and legal battles that intensified after Dobbs in 2022 overturned Roe. Crisis pregnancy centers have grown in number, with Republican-led states sending tax dollars their way, while Democratic-led states, including New Jersey, emphasize abortion access and scrutinize what they call misleading tactics. NPR's coverage underscores that ideological divide, which makes donor privacy and investigatory power flashpoints. The case could set ground rules for how far states can go when probing ideologically driven nonprofits on either side.
Tell us more about those website issues that caught the state's eye.
Investigators said First Choice's client-facing pages downplayed its pro-life, faith-based mission and used headings that might imply abortion services or referrals. Disclaimers that they don't provide or refer for abortions were present but sometimes placed at the bottom, according to court filings summarized by ABC News. The state also looked at claims about staff qualifications and medical services, including ultrasound and counseling descriptions. Those points fed the state's view that Consumer Fraud Authority was the right tool to ask for records.
What about the abortion pill reversal piece?
That's been a lightning rod. Medical groups have criticized it as unproven and potentially risky, and several states have litigated over laws requiring doctors to tell patients it's possible. The state flagged First Choice's promotion of it as a red flag for substantiation, a detail reported by NPR. First Choice counters that discussing it is part of counseling and that the state is policing speech, not just medical claims.
How do the donor disclosure concerns compare to past cases?
Supporters draw a line from NAACP versus Alabama to today, saying that compelled donor lists deter support when there's real risk of backlash. Americans for Prosperity extended that logic to modern charitable disclosures, requiring narrow tailoring even outside a criminal context. The Washington Post's past coverage of AFPF noted the court didn't demand proof of widespread harm to find a chill, which First Choice argues should apply here. New Jersey replies that a one-off investigatory subpoena is different from a blanket, ongoing reporting rule.
If the court sides with First Choice, what's the practical effect?
It would likely open the door for earlier federal court challenges to state subpoenas that allegedly chill speech or association. That could constrain attorneys general nationwide, forcing them to justify donor or broad document demands up front, especially when ideological nonprofits are involved. SCOTUS blog suggests the ruling could refine how courts weigh ripeness and chilling effect in the pre-enforcement posture. It wouldn't stop all investigations, but it would raise the bar for certain kinds of requests.
And if New Jersey wins?
Targets would generally have to wait for the state to move to enforce a subpoena, then raise defenses in that forum. That would preserve state investigatory latitude and reduce pre-enforcement trips to federal court, which the state says is essential for consumer protection. It could also signal that the mere existence of a subpoena, without enforcement steps, isn't enough to show concrete injury. Groups worried about donor privacy might need stronger evidence of harassment or coercion before federal courts will hear them.
You mentioned the ACLU's role. Why is that significant?
The ACLU often opposes crisis pregnancy centers, policies in other contexts, but here it backs the free speech and association claims against compelled disclosure. The Public's radio noted that cross-ideological alliance to illustrate the case's broader First Amendment implications. It reinforces ADF's argument that the issue isn't just about abortion, but about advocacy groups with unpopular views across the spectrum. That may resonate with justices wary of rules that cut one way today and another way tomorrow.
Do we know how the justices seem to lean?
We won't handicap it with certainty, and we're still digesting the audio and transcript posted today, but expect probing on the limits of pre-enforcement suits. Conservative justices have recently favored robust First Amendment protection in disclosure cases, yet some are cautious about inviting federal courts into every state investigation. Liberals may be sympathetic to state consumer protection powers but also protective of association rights in sensitive contexts. As NPR and OYAs often remind listeners, outcomes can hinge on how the court frames the injury and tailoring.
How soon could this reshape investigations beyond abortion?
Potentially by late spring or early summer, when the opinion likely drops. This could set boundaries that apply to union groups, environmental nonprofits, gun rights organizations, and more. Ballotpedia's case tracker emphasizes the ripple effects for any ideological nonprofit facing document and donor demands. If the court elevates the chilling effect threshold for ripeness, you'll see strategic litigation surge. If it tightens that threshold, states may feel emboldened to demand records first and defend later.
Remind us what makes a case ripe in this context.
Ripeness looks at whether the legal questions are fit for decision now and the hardship of waiting. First choice says the chill is present and ongoing, so the hardship is real. The state says nothing is compelled yet, so any harm is speculative. The Third Circuit thought the case should wait for enforcement, echoing traditional reluctance to intervene prematurely. As Cornell Law's overview of ripeness notes, First Amendment cases sometimes get leeway because delay can itself suppress speech.
How are crisis pregnancy centers responding overall?
Many are watching closely, seeing this as a bellwether for how aggressively states can police their messaging and donors post-Dobbs. Amy Huber said she hopes a win will stop, quote, prosecuting, harming, or harassing, end quote, these centers. A line ABC News highlighted from her statement. Groups on the other side argue oversight is necessary so clients aren't misled about the availability of abortion or medical services. The tension shows why donor privacy and investigatory power are colliding so sharply now.
Any final note on what listeners can do if they want more detail?
The Supreme Court's website posted same-day audio and the transcript for today's arguments. And SCOTUS blog has accessible analysis that will be updated as reactions come in. NPR's piece and The Public's Radio both lay out the investigation's origins and the competing legal frames. And Oyez can help with background on precedents like NAACP versus Alabama and AFPF versus Bonta. The opinion will take months, but the stakes for speech, privacy, and consumer protection are already clear.
Big case with big implications. Chloe, thanks for breaking it down.
Thanks, Grace.
Here are some other headlines. Catastrophic monsoons and cyclones have killed at least 338 across Indonesia, Sri Lanka, and Thailand as of Tuesday, with rescues hobbled by collapsed roads, washed-out bridges, and severed communications. Indonesia reports 744 dead. Flash floods in Sumatra are linked by environmental groups to illegal logging. Sri Lanka counts 410 dead, its president, Anara Kumara Dissanayake, declaring a state of emergency and formally requesting international aid for a historic calamity. Southern Thailand mourns 181. With more than 800 still missing, Indonesia's Environmental Forum brands Sumatra's tragedy a man-made crisis, reigniting debates on deforestation and climate resilience. President Prabowo Subianto directs relief to Aceh and North Sumatra. AUNDP report warns I could trigger next great divergence, widening gaps between rich and poor nations. The Asia-Pacific is tagged ground zero. Gains will flow to countries with robust digital infrastructure, while those lacking connectivity risk exclusion from the global economy. It flags demographic risks. Women are twice as likely as men to hold jobs exposed to automation, and youth employment in high-exposure roles is already sliding. Lead author Michael Muthakrishna urges a people-first approach. UNDP economist Philip Shellikins wants less hype and more democratized access. Prescription: invest in broadband, upgrade education, and bolster social protections to keep nations from being stranded. India has ordered that within 90 days, smartphone makers pre-install the government's Sanchar Sati cyber safety app. Early reports cast it as undeletable, but Telecom Minister Jyotiraditya Scindia now says users can remove it and installation is voluntary. The app helps track lost phones, verify used devices, and report cyber fraud. Privacy advocates warn of surveillance and mission creep. The order jars industry norms, with manufacturers like Apple expected to push for a middle path. In the world's second-largest smartphone market, this tests consent versus security and how far preloads can roam from helpful to heavy-handed. The OECD raised its 2025 global growth forecast to 3.2%, saying the world economy has stayed durable despite President Trump's new tariff tripwires. Cushioning comes from an AI investment boom and companies front-loading imports before levies landed. But the beat may slow. Growth is seen easing to 2.9% in 2026 as tariff costs hit consumers and business spending cools. The U.S. outlook for 2025 is up to 2.0%, yet Secretary General Matthias Cormann warns trade policy whiplash remains a downside risk. Today's buffer from techno bulls and logistical lunges could soon feel like a toll road for households. At COP30 in Belém, Brazil, hopes fell like rain. The summit closed with a watered-down deal lacking a roadmap to phase out fossil fuels, omitting explicit language on oil, gas, and coal. Panama negotiator Juan Carlos Monterrey Gomez called that stance complicity, not neutrality. Delegates pledged to triple adaptation finance for developing nations by 2035, but progress was hampered by the absence of the United States and pushback from major oil producers. Critics call it a win for the fossil industry, a lobbyist jamboree where the 1.5-degree goal looks almost gone, eroding confidence a decade after Paris. That's all we have for now. Today's episode was made by Alexander King with GPT-5, Gemini Pro 3, Gemini Flash 2.5, and Google Cloud Text-to-Speech. I hope you have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow, Alex.